Our next speaker is Annie Lien. She is an expert in autonomous driving, particularly from the business end. And she's a great friend, and we've had lots of cool lunch meetings. So here's Annie.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Doug. So first, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank Doug for organizing this. This is a lot of work. I've done this before. Organizing conferences is a lot of work. So this is great. And I'm honored to be here. And I hope that you'll enjoy this. I know autonomous driving is a big topic right now. I hope you find this insightful. If you don't, please come and talk to me. By all means, give me feedback. I'm open to it. All right, so we're going to talk about Crossroads of autonomous driving. I was actually going to name this the fork of autonomous driving, but then I thought you guys might have thought I'm talking about food. So we're going to talk about Crossroads of autonomous driving. So we're going to dive into about 3 different sections. The beginning, for the sake of this presentation, what I consider the beginning of autonomous driving, R&D, research and development. And then we'll go into the recent, past, and the future, more specifically the competitive landscape, consumer demands, policy, and liability. And I'll leave with a little bit of quick food for thought for you. So first of all, the beginning. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the good old DARPA days. So we had 3 challenges way back in 2004, 5, and 7 of DARPA. These were competitions that were sponsored and organized by DARPA, the US government agency. And any team from universities, from companies, anyone could enter a team. And the goal was you wanted to make cars drive themselves. The first 2 challenges, the Grand Challenge of 2004 and 5, the challenge was make cars drive themselves through the Mojave Desert in California. It was about 142 miles, I think it was, the route that you had to make the car drive itself. And it was really rough desert terrain. So there were no pedestrians, there were no stoplights, no street signs, et cetera, that you see in everyday driving, but it was very rough desert terrain. It was hot, it was a lot of sand, so the sensors could get dusty, et cetera. So it had its own challenges. And remember, this is 12 years ago. So technology back then was not as advanced as it is today. So it was still a great challenge to try to conquer. And then in 2007, DARPA decided we're going to do what's called the urban challenge. Now we have the mock city scenario. So instead of the desert terrain, we now have mock city tests that your car would have to pass and drive itself. So there's an abandoned military base in Victorville, California, and DARPA basically took that abandoned military base and converted it to a fake city. There were intersections, there were stoplights, there were stop signs, there were actually residential-looking streets with houses. They were abandoned houses, but there were houses along the flanking the streets. And they also made these nice tracks where you had a figure-8 track, and your car had to merge into traffic autonomously. No driver. I'm talking about driverless. Not just a car driving itself with a driver in it. So these were the 3 challenges, and a lot of academic teams entered. And what were the results in the end? So for the first Grand Challenge of 2004, Carnegie Mellon, this is the Carnegie Mellon car that you see here, they actually went the furthest, which was out of the 142-mile desert terrain route, they went the furthest of 7-point-something miles. And so they technically kind of won because they went the furthest out of all the teams, but DARPA decided, you know what, no one finished the 142 miles, no one has really won this competition, so the $1 million prize was not given to anyone. It was $1 million prize. And so then DARPA said, we're going to do the same challenge the next year, in 2005. Let's see how advanced and how much you improve in the next year. So again, in 2005, there was the same Grand Challenge. And what happens now, we actually have teams that finish the 142-mile trek without any drivers in there. And the first place winner was Stanford. This is the blue SUV that you see there. They finished first. And then the second prize and also third prize were actually Carnegie Mellon. So Carnegie Mellon actually entered 2 cars for the Grand Challenge. So we actually had, and there were about 5 or 6 teams in total that actually finished this 142 miles. So it was a great accomplishment for the autonomous driving research world. So in 2007, we really upped it, and we decided, okay, we're going to drive autonomously through mock cities. And now we get 3 different teams that won. So the first prize was Carnegie Mellon, the black SUV. Second prize was Stanford, the blue Passat. So Carnegie Mellon and Stanford sort of swapped. And then the third prize was Victor Tango, which was Virginia Tech. And the final race, this urban challenge, was a 6-hour race. It was a whole mock city where your car just drove on itself in 6 hours, and it was actually interacting and negotiating between other robot cars and interacting with what were these test cars. So DARPA actually had real professional trained drivers in test cars driving around as if they were manual drivers in the real world. So it was a very complex competition. And we had people who actually finished the whole race and finished the line. 11 teams actually got to this final race out of over 100 teams. I'm happy to say that my team was one of the 11 teams. And we were a really underdog team. We had no money, resources, et cetera, and we actually got into the final race, which is great, 11 out of 100 teams. And one thing I want to emphasize about this period in autonomous driving is a lot of the players, a lot of the people pushing this topic were actually researchers, scientists, geeks like me. So basically, you didn't really see any mainstream players yet. The car companies such as VW sponsored Stanford team, GM sponsored Carnegie Mellon. So we had car companies interested in sense of sponsoring for marketing purposes. But in terms of R&D, research and development, it was a lot of real deep scientists and researchers that were pushing the limits. And this is how everything started back then, right? So then what about the recent past and the future? What do we get? So first, let's look at the competitive landscape. I break this down into two periods when we think about this. So the recent past and the future, I see the last, let's say, 12 years ago to about 2011, and this is not a hard breakdown. 2011 is just my arbitrary year that I picked. But I see the first period of this recent past and future as the dark ages. Why? Because there were, again, only scientists and researchers who were really pushing the limits of this technology and really, really passionate about this. The OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers, OEMs and car manufacturers were really more interested in driver assistance systems. There's a little bit of difference between driver assistance systems and full autonomous driving. We were interested as researchers in full autonomous driving. We wanted to make cars drive themselves with no driver, if possible. Driver assistance system is just, for example, adaptive cruise control. You're really just going straight and following your lead vehicle. That's it. Or you have blind spot detections. That's it. It's very limited compared to full autonomous driving. And so the dark ages is when scientists and researchers like me and geeks like me were trying to push this topic, and no one was really that interested, really, in the mainstream industry. They were interested in driver assistance systems, great, but to us, we thought, come on, we can do so much more. Google was the only one, I have that in parentheses, Google was the only one who really showed any interest from a mainstream company standpoint. They started their driverless and autonomous driving research in 2009. And in general, the general public, if you talk to society about autonomous driving, they thought autonomous vehicles, that's what AV stands for, autonomous vehicles are kind of crazy. It's science fiction. No one really believed us that we think we can actually one day make cars drive themselves as a real product. So what happens in the Renaissance? We get a whole bunch of mainstream companies pop up and invest and really put a lot of effort into research and development in autonomous driving. Now it's not just academic research and scientists and geeks like me. Now we have real companies in the industry of high tech wanting to push this. And notice I put in this here, and by the way, this is just some of the companies. This is really a very short list. Notice I put here in the Renaissance, the companies that start showing interest in pushing and investing, they're non-traditional car companies, like Tesla, or they're non-car companies, like Google and Lyft and Uber and Apple. So we see in this last 5 years, in this next period of recent present, we see non-car companies actually show an interest and push it. And this is the Renaissance. This actually caused the Renaissance because we now have companies that are fast, nimble, that are innovative, that want to push the limits, that are bold, and that are willing to take some risks when it comes to R&D of technology. Car companies traditionally are very conservative. They're a little slow in the product cycle. It takes about 4 to 7 years to really produce the product from conception all the way to putting it in the car in the showroom. And rightfully so, they're a little slow because of safety and regulations and standards. So it's not that they want to be slow, it's just the way that the car industry has worked simply to make sure the cars are really safe. But these non-car companies are saying, you know what, why don't we try to make the product cycle shorter and be faster and be bold and still be safe? And this is great. This is what's really pushed autonomous driving. This is why today we have so much interest. And so I actually give a lot of credit to non-car companies for the point that we are today. All right, so what about the future of competitive landscape? First, we have to get into the fact that the core components of the technology, I think, are going to become much more important. So we're going to have a lot of startups and new companies. They've already started. We're going to have a lot more startups and new companies actually start popping up. And they're going to be focused on either the operating platform, the operating system platform, or the perception, the software, or the decision-making, or some new sensors, like Quantigy is a new sensor startup, or some new chipset and processing power. We're going to see a lot of this, and we're going to see a lot of, I think, investment, a lot more investments. A lot of investments has already gone in, and we think we're going to continue, and this is going to continue in this trend. And what does this mean for the traditional big companies? It means that we're going to have a lot more partnerships and acquisitions between the traditional big companies, and I'm talking about the car companies and the non-car companies, so also the Googles and the Apples of the world. We're going to see that all these small startups and small new companies are going to partner a lot with the big companies, and then there will be acquisitions. I think this is going to happen quite predominantly in the coming years. And this now leads to also new business models. So right now, cars are about ownership, right? It's about this emotional attachment to your car that's your baby. I don't think that we'll ever get rid of that. I think we'll always have some sort of emotional attachment to our cars, especially something like a Tesla, which is a great car. It's very emotionally appealing. But at the same time, we're going to have a lot of ride sharing. And we're going to see, I think, it's not going to be overnight, but eventually we're going to see an equilibrium between ride sharing and car ownership. And eventually, and this is decades away, maybe 2 or 3 decades, we're going to probably see more ride sharing and less ownership. So new business model in the automotive industry and autonomous driving is going to actually be our future. And I'm talking about a few decades away. These are some of the companies, by the way, that have this year alone partnered between the traditional companies and then these new small companies. And this is just going to continue. Okay, let's go into consumer demands. Again, with this period in the beginning, during the dark ages, we had not that much interest. Driver assistance, advanced driver assistance sales were really low in America. They were a little higher in Europe, especially Germany. But in America, they were very low, maybe 3, 4, 5%. And again, autonomous driving and autonomous vehicles were kind of crazy as an idea. So what do we get for the next 5 years? We get some interest. This is a J.D. Power this is a screenshot of a J.D. Power results of a study, the emerging tech study that they do I think it's every 2 or 3 years they do this. And they asked, if you have the option to buy an autonomous driving system for $3,000, would you buy it? And you see here, 25% of the males said definitely or probably would buy it for $3,000, and then 14% of females said definitely or probably. I'll be honest, I actually don't really believe in just handwritten studies. I don't think that people really know what they're answering when you ask them a question and they answer. I think that people have to really have some sort of experience, maybe have the car overnight, maybe even just a test drive for autonomous driving. Then they really know if they really want to buy it and how much they would pay. Maybe they'd pay more than $3,000. Maybe they wouldn't want to pay $3,000. So I don't really give that much weight to studies where it's just written. But regardless of that point, I think that it shows in general, when you just simply ask a person, and a quarter of at least males are saying yes, that is very different from back in 2000, let's say 5 or 6. When you ask people, they would look at you like you were crazy. And if you describe it, they would say, I don't think so. So we're seeing interest. So what does this mean for the future of consumer demands? So first we have to get into this topic of two camps before we actually talk about the future of consumer demands. First, we have the automotive camp, and then we have the Google camp. So the automotive camp, Lex did a good job of briefly explaining the different NHTSA levels. The automotive camp is we're going to take these levels and we're going to deploy them and launch them incrementally. We're going to first give you a level 1. Actually, they're already out there. Then we're going to go to level 2, which is a little more automation. Then we're going to go to level 3, which is pretty advanced automation, but it's not really full automation. And then level 4, and we're talking about NHTSA level 4, is the real full autonomous driving where you really don't have to pay attention at all, anytime, anywhere. And the auto industry has taken this step, this position of we're going to introduce these little by little, one by one, incrementally, because one, we want to make sure that we're introducing technology that's really robust, and therefore we're taking it step by step, baby steps, sort of. And that means that sometimes you need to monitor, you need to be ready to take over at all times, you need to make sure that you are alert and you are essentially still responsible. The Google camp says, forget all of that. This is unrealistic. Asking people to pay attention and still monitor their driving and be ready to take over any time when the car sometimes drives itself is just confusing. And it's just against human nature. It's like asking your passenger, if you're a driver in a manual car, and you're asking your passenger to pay attention at all times, just in case I can't really drive in the next moment, please pay attention and take over the wheel for me. That's what you're asking drivers in a partially automated car, such as the autopilot. That's what you're saying. So the Google camp is saying, forget this. We are going to go straight to full automation. We are not going to launch something or focus on the incremental steps. We're going to focus on making a car that goes from A to B, fully self-driving, and therefore you can do whatever you want and not pay attention, not worry about taking any responsibility. Now, there are studies, there are lots of pros and cons of either camp, and there are lots of arguments, and this is a pretty hot debate right now about which is the right direction to focus on. And there are a lot of studies, human-machine interface studies, user studies, human factor studies, about how long it takes, if you were to do the automated route, how long does it take for an average human to take over safely? And a lot of studies have concluded that it takes anywhere from 5 to 8 seconds for a human to safely take back control. So if a car's driving itself and you want a human to take over again, manual driving, it takes anywhere from 5 to 8 seconds average for them to do this. Sometimes, some studies, it actually could take them up to 17 seconds. So I have my iPhone here, and I'm just going to demonstrate how long 5 to 8 seconds or 17 seconds is. So I'm going to start my stopwatch. I started it. 8 seconds. 17 seconds. That's how long 8 seconds or 17 seconds is. So imagine you're driving in your autopilot, and I'm sure some of you do this. You're driving and you are on the road and it's driving itself, you have the autopilot on, and you decide, you know what, I'm going to text, even though you're not supposed to. Yeah, I'm going to check some of my emails. And, well, you know, the car's driving itself, it's doing pretty good. Let me check some more texts. Oh, look at this picture. This is interesting. And then you thought, oh, let me go on the internet, on my iPhone. And then the car decides to beep or whatever it does to warn you, I can't really keep driving. Please take over. It might be beeping or whatever. And you look up and you think, I don't know why it's beeping at me. I really want to continue. And it's beeping. Beep, beep. And you're reading. And you look up again, I don't understand why this car is beeping at me. You're on the highway, you just want to do what you want to do, and next thing you know, you look up and there's a construction zone that pops up in your front of you, and you think, oh, crap, and you want to take over the wheel now, but it's too late. 17 seconds later, you want to take over the wheel. What will happen? You probably will crash into those cones or whatever else that's happening if your autopilot or your partial automated system has been telling you to take over and you're taking over at 17 seconds point. So my position is the Google camp. I believe that it is safer to just do a full automation A to B, and the incremental step is actually a little unsafe. It doesn't mean that we should not ever try to deploy any system it's only partially automated. I also believe we need to deploy things as quickly as possible and get things into the hands of consumers and get the data and learn from it and therefore innovate more from the data. So there's probably a good balance between doing incremental steps and doing full automation, but I definitely don't believe that it's safer to do incremental steps. Okay, so let's go into policy and liability. Again, in the past, we didn't have that much interest or activity. A lot of policy, regulations, and standards were all about driver distraction, people texting while they're manually driving, for example. So this even drives the message even further, that people just won't pay attention when they're in the car if you're asking them to. So a lot of activities back then in policy were about how do we tell people to not text while they're manually driving? How do we educate them? Driver assistance systems were also a hot topic back then, but not fully autonomous cars or autonomous vehicles. Then the next 5 years, we get a period where I would say was a little too active. And what do I mean by that is we end up getting a patchwork of state regulations from state to state. So this all started with Nevada in 2000. It actually started in 2011, but they actually passed the legislation in 2012. Google actually went to Nevada and said, hey, we want to push autonomous driving. We know there's no legal framework. There's no liability framework to work with. Do you want to collaborate? And so Nevada said, sure, we'll introduce a bill. So they introduced a bill and passed a bill for testing of autonomous cars. So this is for the R&D part of autonomous cars, not for deployment to real consumers like you. So basically, Nevada passes legislation telling R&D companies and engineers how we should test. Basically a list of criteria of what your car needs to meet, and how and when and why is it that you need to test this way, et cetera, to make sure you're testing safely. So Nevada did this, and then suddenly all these other states decided to do this. And now we have all these states that have all these individual regulations about testing autonomous cars on public roads, and they're not really consistent. There's little bits of inconsistent criteria and requirements that we need to meet as R&D professionals. And it's very difficult for R&D when you have inconsistent regulations state by state. We could be driving in California, and we want to cross the border to Nevada. California has regulations for testing, and Nevada has their own regulations for testing. And we cross the border. First of all, we have to stop at the border of California and Nevada and change our license plates, because we are supposed to have a specific license plate if we're testing an autonomous car. And then we have to make sure we do have a permit in Nevada too, right, to drive? Yes, we do, which meant that we had to tweak some little things in the car between Nevada and California to make sure we met both requirements. So it's a lot of overhead, it's a lot of unnecessary, I'd say, busy work that we really don't need in R&D for autonomous driving. So we really do not want this patchwork of inconsistent state-level regulations to continue. Instead, what do we want? The future. We want a consistent federal guideline. So in other words, at the federal level, let's have a consistent guideline, not necessarily regulations, not necessarily rules that tell us exactly how we need to test or when we need to test, et cetera, et cetera. Just guidelines about what's safe and what's not safe. And these guidelines can be, they should be working guidelines. In other words, they can be updated easily. Once you pass a regulation in any legislative body, it's very difficult to change the contents of a legislation and a regulation. So instead, just guidelines that can be updated constantly, because we're still in the end of its innovative stage. We have a lot to do. We still can solve a lot of problems in autonomous driving, so we need this dynamic policy environment and the freedom to innovate and push the limits still. We also would very welcome investments. The federal government has, I think it's $4 billion that they're going to invest in the next 10 years in autonomous driving research, which is great. We definitely welcome investments, private and government, public. Okay, other countries are also working towards policy in terms of autonomous driving, and one country that's been doing a really good job is the UK. So I actually know the director of this, and he said, our rule is simple. Don't be stupid. That's all they ask. It's not that you have to have this or that in your car and make sure you have this permit. No, just don't be stupid. So they have very, very lax regulations for us, for their R&D engineers in UK. We would like to follow this in the United States. And finally, in insurance, premium shifts. So I think manufacturers and car companies or Googles of the world or Apple's world will eventually pay more liability insurance for cars the more and more automation we have. And so therefore, hopefully, as consumers, we'll probably pay less in terms of premiums, and car manufacturers will pay more. And it will actually just shift a little bit. Indirectly, we might still pay the premium because the rates that we pay for the rides or the purchase of the automation systems might be incorporated. The premiums that the manufacturers are paying, it might be incorporated into what we pay as consumers. So in the end, it's just a shifting. Okay, so last thing, food for thought. So I've basically outlined two crossroads, two forks in this path of autonomous driving. We have old traditional companies and new disruptive companies. We have old beliefs in business models and new beliefs in new business models. And we have this restrictive sort of environment and regulation environment and policy and attitude. And then we have this progressive, open-minded attitude. So I actually definitely lean towards the new, the progressive. Give us freedom, give us the power to really push the limits, be bold in this. But not everyone believes in this, and there are debates and conflicts in the industry about what's really the right approach. And so I ask you as an audience, if you were to work in this field, which path would you take? Would you take the incremental step, which is granted very safe? I agree. It's guaranteed safe, actually, the incremental step. Or would you take the little bit more risky, little more bold step, which would definitely push the limits and push autonomous driving a lot quicker? And of course, we would consider safety as part of it, but we would probably risk some things a little more. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so just, I'm not sure that the question you ask is an either-or question. It seems to me, as a driver, I don't want to own a car that doesn't have a steering wheel. However, as a consumer, I wouldn't mind summoning a car that doesn't have a steering wheel to take me somewhere because I'm not near my car.
Yes, I agree with you. So that's why I mentioned I don't think the concept of ownership is ever going to disappear. I think that in the future, and again, I'm talking decades, a few decades away, maybe 15 years, but I think that maybe we could have a lot of ride-sharing business models and fleets owned by companies such as Google's or whatnot, and we could pay rides for our daily commute. But then we also have your Tesla that you drive on the weekends, or maybe you'll drive long distance to a road trip or something. So I think we'll have definitely, it's not or, we'll have a combination of the two.
With the two forks that you've drawn there, is there any credence to maybe if you do it incrementally, you can stay ahead of regulation, so therefore you can get farther?
No, so basically if you do it, the thing about regulations is in the past, generally, traditionally, regulations, how it works for cars, for any sort of product in general that needs some sort of safety regulation as part of the process. What you do is you innovate, you have a new concept, you innovate, you reiterate, and you go through iterations of R&D, you test and validate, and you actually go through this whole R&D cycle. And then once you get to a point where you actually have a real product that actually works, and now you know what works well and what doesn't and what the limits are, et cetera, then you actually regulate. That's really traditionally how regulation has worked. So this question about whether we do incremental steps would actually get ahead of regulations, I don't think it's really, that's not the focus. The focus is what stage are we at in R&D? We're at really more in the beginning, actually. We're not at this stage where we're testing and validating known solutions already. We have some known solutions, but there's also more solutions to be done. So regulations, I think regulations should come a little later, and I think the Google camp actually would get ahead of the regulations a little more for that reason, right?
Would it be possible, though, doing it incrementally will hasten the general public's acceptance of autonomous driving too? If they're fed it, it's the frog in the pot,
So so your question is, would incremental steps encourage the public to
let them accept it more readily?
Yeah, I don't think so, to be honest, because what you're going to have is people are going to be in these incremental or partial automation systems like your autopilot, and they're going to start wanting more and more the automation part of the partial automation. they're going to start wanting more and more to text, to read, to do whatever they want when the car is partially driving itself. And so they're going to probably start wanting this full automation even more. So it's not necessarily that will make them accept and hasten their interests. I think it'll actually frustrate them a little after a while. So I think it's better just to go straight for the gold.
Hey, Annie. There's a great video from the CEO of Mobileye when he talked about those two different scenarios and the different approaches that are necessary. The very kind of processor-intensive approach that Mobileye and Tesla is taking, where you're capturing huge amounts of data in real time and having to figure out what the hell's going on, versus the Google approach, which is let's capture all the data beforehand, get a centimeter accurate version of the world, and then only look at the differences. Do you have a view for... The Google approach seems to be very feasible in strictly controlled environments for relatively small areas. To do that across the whole of the US seems like a monumental problem.
So I think it's actually a combination of both. It's not the Google or the Mobileye approach. I think the Google approach is a good way to start. For example, I can imagine in 2 or 3 years, Google might launch something where it's just in a very geographically limited area, maybe around their Mountain View campus, or maybe their Austin, Texas testing grounds where they're testing on public roads there. I can imagine they'll launch something where there's a fully autonomous shuttle service or ride-sharing service from A to B in a few routes around the Google campus in Mountain View. And that will be full autonomy from A to B. Even though it's just a small geographical area, that will actually work. And so their approach is actually good to start. And then bring in the Mobileye approach, to bring in the real-time data and crowdsourcing of the maps, et cetera, and then bring that in, and then you can scale what you started off in a small geographic limitation, you can scale that pretty quickly to other areas and other geographical areas.
Okay, everyone, let's thank Annie.
Thank you. Okay.